On the 1st of May, 1707, the Acts of Union officially united the kingdoms of Scotland and England to form Great Britain. This marked a pivotal moment in Scottish history, blending its distinct identity into a broader British narrative. But Scotland's story stretches back far further, into a past rich with ancient kingdoms, legendary heroes, and enduring cultural heritage. For centuries, Scotland stood as a land of rugged highlands and rolling lowlands, its clans fiercely independent yet deeply intertwined. From the mysterious builders of the Neolithic wonders like Skara Brae to the rise of powerful medieval dynasties, Scotland's history is one of resilience and innovation. Despite numerous challenges, including wars of independence and economic struggles, the Scots forged a nation of remarkable influence. But how did this proud land, shaped by its dramatic landscapes and vibrant people, become the Scotland we know today? And what role does its history play in defining its place in the world? Right from the very beginning, Scotland has been no ordinary land. It's a land perched on the northern edge of the British Isles, and has been a key player for trade and war. Today, Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. It is bordered by England in the south, the North Sea to the east, the Irish Sea to the southwest, and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. Even though this land is mostly surrounded by water, all of the regions in Scotland are as different as night and day. First, there is the southern uplands with fertile farmlands and rolling hills that form a border with Britain. Then, there is the very heart of Scotland, which is the central lowlands. This is the most populated area in Scotland, which boasts cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow. Then, there's also the Highlands and Islands. This part of Scotland is covered in mountains, glaciers, and several lochs. However, Scotland has not always been this great land of beauty. There were times when the landscape was very different. Millions of years ago, Scotland was covered in thick layers of ice. It was a frozen wasteland that remained barren even when the weather was warm and the ice melted. When the first settlers arrived in Scotland in 9600 BC, the Ice Age was just starting to phase off. The forests were barely growing and animals barely roamed the land. So, why then did they come to this wild and barren land? What drew them here? You see, these first settlers came over 12,000 years ago. The glaciers had retreated, and Scotland was filled with open plains and wild rivers and forests. These settlers were some of the first people to ever set foot on the land. They were Mesolithic hunters and gatherers who had crossed from Europe looking for fertile lands and following animals. These people found home when they arrived in Scotland, but this was only the beginning. Life in Scotland was far from easy. They had to use their stone tools to hunt deer and fish in the rivers and lochs. They also had to live in shelters made only from wood and animal skin. Somehow, these people and their children were able to survive the harsh conditions by moving from place to place. By the time they had lived there for 1,000 years, Scotland had gotten warmer. Forests had begun to grow, and rivers were flowing. The Mesolithic people soon began to live a more settled life. They started farming and raising herds and moved to a more Neolithic way of life. But they also did something incredible that hadn't been done by their ancestors. They were able to build permanent settlements in Scotland. One of these settlements is Skara Brae in Orkney. This ancient village is older than the pyramids of Egypt. These people were so genius. They were able to build stone houses with beds and shelves. But they didn't just build things, they left things too. It was the Neolithic people who left behind mysterious monuments like the standing stones of Callanish. However, this would not last forever. By 2000 BCE, Scotland had moved to the Bronze Age, and everything was changing fast. For the first time, they could build larger communities and start trading with their neighbors. They traded on tin and copper, and built trade routes that made the nation richer than ever before. But just as these settlers were finally getting settled in and starting to enjoy the land, a new group was rising. This new group would change northern Scotland as they knew it and leave their marks forever. This group was known as the Picts. The Picts started to dominate northern Scotland in 300 CE. They were a mysterious group that left historians scratching their heads trying to unsolve them. While some historians say that they were the descendants of the Bronze Age and Iron Age Scotland settlers, others say that they were a group that came from northern Europe. The Romans were the first set of people to call this group, called the Pict. The name Pict means the painted ones, and they got this name because they painted and tattooed their bodies with symbols and patterns. But if you think their paintings were all there was to them, you'd be wrong. You see, the Pict also had a very interesting matrilineal society that passed lineage through women. So as this group banded together, they became stronger. Soon enough, they started to build powerful kingdoms like the Fortriu and had fortresses scattered around the land. They were strong warriors, skilled farmers, and artists. This made them able to plant oats, rear livestock, and also hunt for deer. They were also able to create carvings on standing stones. But the stronger they grew, the more they spread across Scotland. While the other settlers traded with them, there were also moments of conflict. However, the Picts were able to defeat them and establish their dominance. But the Pict and the people in Scotland weren't the only ones growing and expanding. Another empire in the south was also growing. This empire was none other than the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire grew, it started to eye Scotland and wanted to add it to its empire. This would be the beginning of a bloody war for the soul of Scotland. By the start of the 1st century, Europe was already seeing a new leader. This leader was none other than the Roman Empire. They were conquering lands and even managed to conquer Great Britain by 43 CE. However, there was one part of Europe that the Roman Empire wanted. This part was none other than Scotland. At the time, the Romans called Scotland Caledonia. To them, Caledonia was not just an untapped land. It was a land filled with resources such as timber, metals, and fertile ground. However, to take control of this land, they would need to not just defeat the Caledonians, but they would also have to conquer the Picts. This was hard because the Picts were strong warriors who were ready to defend the land at any cost. But the Roman governors in Britain could care less. They saw Scotland as the ultimate prize and proof of their power. By 79 AD, they were ready to invade Scotland. At the time, General Gnaeus Julius Agricola was the Roman general in charge of Britain, and he began marching towards Scotland. Not only did he have a well-trained army, but he also had a plan to defeat Caledonia. First, he had already sent scouts to Scotland to gather as much information as possible about the tribes and the lands. Armed with this knowledge, he built several forts along the Gask Ridge. These fortes would help to protect Roman supply lines and control the key routes. It was only after he had done these two things that he and his army began to march into Scotland. But they didn't just march all the way. General Agricola had his men build camps and other forts as they went ahead. It was slow, but they didn't give up. By the time they attacked Scotland, General Agricola was armed with very crucial knowledge. Thanks to the spies he sent, he knew that the Scottish were divided into several tribes, and these tribes often fought against each other. His master plan was to divide them using these rivalries and make it harder for them to resist him together. He believed that with his plan, he would conquer Scotland in no time. However, he couldn't have been more wrong. The people of Scotland had no plans to easily give up their lands. Instead, the tribes were able to put up a fierce resistance. They had better knowledge of the land and used it to their advantage. They attacked Agricola and his men from the hills, the forests, and the glens before vanishing into the terrain. It was a brutal kind of war that the Romans had never been used to. It was worse because the Scottish were highly unpredictable. But General Agricola would not give up. In 83 CE, he ended up fighting the Caledonian army at Mons Graupius. This was not an easy fight. The Romans were only 15,000 in number, and they were greatly outnumbered by the Caledonian army, which had over 30,000 men. Though outnumbered, the Romans relied on their superior weapons and tactics. The war was costly, but the Romans won. Thousands of the Caledonians were brutally murdered in the war. Those who were left refused to submit to General Agricola. The one thing he was sure of was his strength, which suddenly became a huge thorn in his side. The Caledonians had several tribal leaders and not one single king, so it made it harder for them to be conquered. As if that wasn't bad enough, it also made it difficult for the Romans to negotiate peace. He quickly realized that Scotland would be harder to conquer than he had imagined. As he marched towards the Highlands, he realized those clans were even more brutal. They would ambush his army and cut off Roman supply lines. Frustrated, General Agricola had to go back home. Despite this, the Romans continued trying for several decades to conquer Scotland. Eventually, they came up with a new plan. This plan was known as containment. The idea was simple. If they could not dominate the north of Scotland, they could at least contain it. It was this idea that birthed two of the most impressive walls in ancient Britain. These walls are Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. In 122 CE, Emperor Hadrian began building his wall. It stretched for 73 miles across northern Britain. It also ran from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. Emperor Hadrian believed that this wall would protect the Roman world from the Scottish barbarians in the north. It would also be a statement that would determine where the Roman Empire ended. For this wall, he went all in. At every 1-mile interval, they included a fort. Some of these forts could house Roman soldiers, while others were simply supply hubs. But everything changed in 142 CE. By this time, a new emperor, Antoninus Pius, decided that he wanted more territory and was going to push the boundary. He then began building the Antonine Wall. This wall was built 100 miles after the Hadrian Wall and stretched for 37 miles from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde. However, Emperor Antonine was making a costly mistake. This wall was nothing like the Hadrian Wall. It was shorter and less durable. He hoped it would hold back the Scottish tribes, but it was mostly turf and did little to nothing to stop the tribes. These tribes, mostly led by the Picts, would ruthlessly attack the wall, ambush the soldiers, and cut off supply lines. They were able to use guerrilla warfare and stretch the resources of the Romans thin. Soon enough, the Romans realized the wall was costing them too much to maintain. After several defeats, they abandoned the wall within 20 years and had no choice but to retreat to the Hadrian Wall. The Picts and Caledonians rejoiced. They had successfully managed to frustrate the powerful Roman Empire and force them to retreat. But while they celebrated, new powers were already beginning to rise, and this was only the beginning. As the Roman Empire started to leave Britain, Scotland slowly began to divide into 4 major groups. The Picts were in the east, and the British Kingdom of Strathclyde was in the south. However, a new group was slowly starting to rise in the west. This group was known as the Scoti, and their arrival would change the history of Scotland forever. You see, the Scoti were Celtic people who had originated from modern-day Northern Ireland. These people started to migrate around the 5th century CE. They came from the Kingdom of Dalriada, which is currently County Antrim. After moving across the North Channel for several years, they settled in West Scotland in modern-day Argyll and Inner Hebrides. The Scots were not only attracted to the fertile lands of Scotland, they were also running away from the clashes between other Irish tribes and overpopulation. However, they were skilled in warfare and were ready to fight with other tribes to find a new home for themselves. They brought their stories, music, and culture to Scotland. The Picts started to fight them, but the Scots were determined to find home in Scotland. Instead of focusing on wars, they began to form alliances with other tribes and wove themselves into their new home. They then made Dalriada a major kingdom with a capital at Dunad in Argyll. This kingdom engaged in trading, and soon its influence began to spread across North Britain and the Western Isles. They also kept relations with their Irish homeland, and this allowed them to engage in trade across the sea. But aside from their culture and influence, the Scoti also brought something new to Scotland: the spread of Christianity. You see, in the year 563 CE, a man named Saint Columba came to Scotland from Ireland. Saint Columba wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a missionary and a scholar. He was the man who would Christianize Scotland. When St. Columba came to Scotland, Christianity had already begun spreading in Ireland and was soon starting to spread across Europe. St. Columba was one of those who wanted to spread Christianity and saw Scotland as fertile ground for his missionaries. He believed he could convert the tribes and that with faith he would be able to unite them and bring peace to the region. As soon as he arrived in Scotland, he got to work and founded Iona Abbey on the island of Iona. Iona Abbey was a center for worship, learning, production of manuscripts, and training of other missionaries who would also go to spread the gospel of Christianity. When St. Columba began his conversion work in Scotland, he realized it wasn't going to be a smooth ride. Both the Picts and the Scots had some resistance to his efforts. However, some of their people listened to him enthusiastically. Columba didn't try to force them to convert. Instead, he spoke with the kings and tribal leaders, hoping he could convert them to Christianity. It worked. St. Columba was able to win over the king of the Picts, and this breakthrough began the spread of Christianity in Scotland. Soon enough, churches and monasteries spread across the nation, and the people threw away their pagan traditions and took on Christian practices. But there were some problems. Most of the churches served large areas, and so a different kind of Christianity known as Celtic Christianity started to bloom. In this form of Christianity, the abbots were more important than the bishops, and there were not a lot of laws about the celibacy of the clerics. They also calculated Easter differently from the Roman Church. These issues remained for a long time, even though they were eventually resolved by the 7th century. But religion wasn't the only thing changing in Scotland. There was also a major political transformation going on. The Scoti and Dalriada were growing stronger, and they were on the verge of birthing a new kingdom that would unify Scotland. At this time, Scotland was filled with competing kingdoms and was a very divided land. The Picts were fierce warriors and farmers, and they controlled North and East Scotland. Even though they were strong, they were broken into small tribes that occasionally fought against themselves. This left them open to several threats. On the west of Scotland were the Scoti and Dalriada. They had also established themselves in the land, but they constantly had to fight with the Picts and other rival tribes for dominance. The people of Scotland knew they were divided, but they weren't the only ones who had noticed. Another group of people had noticed as well: the Norse Vikings. These Vikings begin raids across Scotland to take advantage of their weakness. They would target villages, churches, and even the leaders. Both the Scots and the Picts suffered from these raids and grew weaker. It was at this time that a man named Kenneth MacAlpin became the king of Dalriada in 841 AD. But Kenneth MacAlpin wasn't just an ordinary king. Born in 810 AD, Kenneth was born of both Pictish and Scottish heritage. This was very rare at the time, but it also meant that Kenneth was a bridge between these two cultures. As king of the Scoti, Kenneth quickly realized that the Scots and the Picts could not survive if they continued to be separate kingdoms. They had to unite. It was the only way to create a stronger front against the Vikings. While this was a great idea in theory, it was difficult to pull off. How would he unite two groups of people who had fought against each other for centuries? To achieve his goal, he had to wait for the right time. This time came in 839 AD when the Vikings attacked again. This time, they attacked the Picts and wiped out most of the royal family. The Picts were in mourning, and they had no royal head. Kenneth saw this as a chance and seized the moment. He led a series of attacks against the Picts, taking advantage of their weakness, and by 843 AD, he had successfully united the Scots and the Picts as one kingdom. This made him the first king of Alba. Alba meant Scotland. But even after this victory, the actual unification process was difficult. Kenneth had to rely on Christianity to promote the Gaelic language and culture among the Picts, and this helped both sides feel a sense of unity. He also arranged marriages between his family and other royal families to build a stronger bond. While he celebrated this unity, he couldn't forget why it was necessary in the first place. The Vikings were still a threat. The kingdom of Alba was stronger now, but the Vikings were quickly sweeping across Britain and had their eyes set on his new kingdom. Would the kingdom of Alba survive? The Vikings were powerful Norse warriors, skilled sailors, and raiders who came from Scandinavia. They hail from the fjords of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They spread fear across Europe in the 9th century, as they went about destroying and conquering several lands. As they swept through Europe, they had their eyes on Scotland, and by the 8th century they attacked. You see, the Vikings had a strategy that worked well for them. They conducted swift and brutal raids. These raids were so fast, the people barely had any time to respond, and so brutal, they were left devastated after. Too devastated to stop the Vikings from settling and conquering the land. In 802 AD, disaster struck when they used this strategy in Scotland. They attacked Iona Abbey and killed several monks while taking treasures. They then went on to attack other monasteries, leaving fear in the hearts of the Scots and the Picts. By the mid-800s, the Vikings had begun to settle in Scotland. In 867 AD, they seized the south of Northumbria and created a new kingdom known as the Kingdom of York. 3 years later, they also stormed the Britain's fortress of Dumbarton. This allowed them to fully encircle the Kingdom of Alba. Soon enough, they started to establish bases. These bases were in the islands of Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland. They were able to use these bases to launch further attacks. King Kenneth MacAlpin wasn't sitting with his arms folded. The Scots and Picts fought back, but the Vikings were both relentless and brutal, and it was a difficult battle to win. They were mostly unable to match the speed and brutality of the Viking raids. Despite several battles, they had to watch the Vikings take bases in the lands. As the Vikings settled, they slowly turned Hebrides and Orkney into Norse communities and strongholds. In the Hebrides, they were able to mix both Norse and Gaelic cultures, and this allowed them to blend with the Scots who lived there. In Orkney, they also blended with the people. However, this island was a Viking stronghold that was used as a launch pad for raids. As the Vikings took control of Scotland, they brought their language and culture. Soon enough, the people of Scotland started to speak a mix of Norse and Gaelic. They also intermarried, and this cultural blending is still obvious today. They were involved in a trade that stretched across the North Atlantic and into mainland Europe. As the years went by, the Vikings slowly moved from enemies to neighbors. King Kenneth MacAlpin also died in 900, but if you think this marked the end of Scot resistance, then you would be wrong. Scot kept faith up, hoping to reclaim their land until the 13th century, when the ultimate showdown would happen. This showdown was the Battle of Largs. By 1263, a storm was already brewing. The Norse kingdom and what was left of the Scottish monarchy were about to have a major clash. You see, the Scots had been regrouping and had managed to unite themselves under King Alexander III. Despite this, the Norse still ruled over them. For example, several islands, including the Hebrides, were governed as part of the Kingdom of Norway. Now, King of the United Kingdom, King Alexander III had one goal. It was to bring back these territories under Scottish rule. So, by 1262, he put his plan in motion. He sent emissaries to Norway and demanded that King Haakon IV should hand over these territories to him. As expected, King Haakon laughed in their faces and refused. King Alexander refused to give up and began attacking and raiding the Hebrides. When Haakon heard of this, he was furious. Even worse, he decided he was going to teach Alexander a lesson. He gathered a huge fleet of ships and soldiers and headed for Scotland the following year. The stage was set for war. King Haakon might have thought the war would be quick and victory would be easy, but he was wrong. As they got closer to Scotland, they were met with a fierce storm that struck the Firth of Clyde. Many of his ships were scattered, and they had no choice but to land near Largs. King Haakon and his men struggled to save their ships. When King Alexander III heard of this, he saw it as a great opportunity and launched a surprise attack. He gathered an army of about 1,500 knights and infantry and marched to Largs. By October 2nd, 1263, the Battle of Largs had begun. The Norwegians were caught off guard and they couldn't even fight back, not to mention forming a battle line. Haakon and his men also had limited supplies and they were open to guerrilla attacks from the Scots. They were desperate and tried to regroup and fight back, but they lacked reinforcements and even worse, they were fighting on unfamiliar terrain. Haakon and his forces watched themselves slowly fall to the Scot, with several of the men panicking and fleeing. Having no choice, they had to withdraw with what was left of their fleet. By nightfall, Alexander III and his Scot forces had claimed victory, It was also the beginning of the end of Norse control over Scotland. King Haakon IV returned to Norway and died that same year. His successor, Magnus VI, unwilling to take on another battle, signed the Treaty of Perth with the Scots in 1266. In this treaty, they formally handed over the control of Hebrides, Kintyre, and the Isle of Man to Scotland. This marked the end of centuries of Viking control. However, just as King Alexander and Scotland celebrated, a new threat was starting to sprout. This threat was the looming shadow of England. When King Alexander III died in 1286, Scotland was plunged into another crisis over who would succeed him. This was the beginning of another round of chaos. How would they deal with this chaos while handling the threat of England? After King Alexander III died, he left the kingdom with no clear heir. His granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was to be next in line. However, disaster struck and she died on her way to Scotland. By 1290, there were over 12 rivals for the throne. This included John Balliol and Robert Bruce. However, the crown first went to Margaret's fourth son, David I. But there were issues with King David. He had spent most parts of his life in England, where he had been a baron. Now that he was king, he changed the structure of Scotland to feudalism. His change was so drastic that his reign was known as a Davidian revolution. He gave land to several of the nobles in exchange for military support and their loyalty. The nobles then allowed the peasants to live on the land in exchange for their labor. While this brought stability to Scotland, it also brought hierarchy and fragmentalization. Families like the Bruces, Stuarts, and Balliols became incredibly powerful because they managed vast estates. With more families wielding political power, the power struggles among the nobles started to worsen. But some clans unified the people. These clans were located in territories with names like Campbell, MacGregor, and MacDonald. They were like mini-groups that protected their members. While most of the clans were in the Highlands, towns sprung up in the Lowlands. Some of these towns were Perth, Edinburgh, and Stirling. These towns were places of governance and trade. They were some of the first signs that Scotland was no longer a nation of scattered tribes and had become a centralized medieval kingdom. But there was still a problem. The nobles had only become stronger, and now several of them, like John Balliol and Robert Bruce, wanted the throne. As the chaos worsened, some of the nobles began to worry. They were afraid that a civil war would break out, and so they went to King Edward I, the King of England, for help. He agreed to meditate, but this would come at a price. He wanted Scotland to see him as an overlord. The nobles were desperate and agreed. In 1292, King Edward finally crowned John Balliol King of Scotland, but it soon became clear that they had made a massive mistake. King Edward had no respect for King Balliol and undermined his authority every chance he got. The people encouraged Balliol to fight back, and in 1296, Balliol fought against the King of England, another costly mistake. Furious, King Edward gathered forces and invaded Scotland. He defeated Scot forces at the Battle of Dunbar. He also captured Balliol and then declared himself the ruler of Scotland. Scotland had once again lost their independence, but once again, the people refused to give up. Their resistance was fueled by the way they were oppressed by King Edward and his rulership. This time, resistance came from the common people, one of which was William Wallace. William was a commoner who was angry by this oppression. He began to gather a Scot force that would fight for their independence. In 1297, he attacked. He and his forces marched to drive out the English from Scotland. This war ended in the legendary Battle of Stirling Bridge. You see, the English army was being led by the Earl of Surrey, and they easily outnumbered Wallace and his small group of men. The Earl was sure that his men were not only more in number, they were more skilled, and this would easily give him victory. But he was wrong. What he didn't know was that Wallace had a secret plan up his sleeve. This plan was to lure the Earl and his men into a tiny bridge over the Forth River. This bridge was the Stirling Bridge. As the English forces approached this narrow bridge, they quickly realized that their number would be their greatest weakness. They had no choice but to cross in small groups, and this was what Wallace wanted. He and his men attacked these groups, cut them off, and killed them. By nightfall, Wallace and his Scottish forces had won. But this victory would not last forever. At first, Wallace ruled Scotland in the name of John Balliol as guardian of the realm. King Edward was incensed and felt insulted. He returned with a vengeance and came in person to defeat Wallace and the Scots at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. King Wallace escaped, but by 1305, he was caught by King Edward and executed. All hopes for independence for Scotland seemed to vanish. Where would they find another hero that would save them? After the death of Wallace, King Edward appointed John Comyn and Robert the Bruce as guardians of Scotland. However, these two were rivals, and each one of them wanted to be king, but Robert the Bruce was more desperate. You see, Robert was born into a noble family and knew how to play both sides. He sided with England when it suited it, but by 1306 he decided he was done waiting and that England would not crown him king. He wanted to become king right away, even if he had to do it himself. On the 10th of February, 1306, Robert did something brutal. He murdered his rival for the throne, John Comyn, at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. In less than 7 weeks, he was crowned King of Scotland. King Edward would not take this lying down. He led forces to Scotland and attacked Robert and his small army. He was defeated in Methven. He fled, but the English forces continued to hunt him down. As though that was not bad enough, the Scots did not trust his leadership. However, things started to change when Edward died in 1307. With Edward dead, Robert the Bruce started to gather support again and make strong alliances. Edward's heir, Edward II, decided to put a stop to Robert's influence once and for all. He gathered an army of 20,000 men, and they marched north. Robert also had an army of his own, but they were only 6,000 men and greatly outnumbered. If he was going to win this war, he would have to be strategic. He led his men to Stirling Castle, and they laid siege on it. You see, the Stirling Castle was crucial, and anyone who controlled it would be able to dominate central Scotland. By June 23rd, the war had begun. Robert and his men stopped an English force as they marched on. In a famous duel, Robert faced an English knight known as Sir Henry de Bohun. He had only one axe, but he easily killed the knight with a single blow. The Scot forces cheered, and this boosted their morale. But Robert also had more under his sleeve. He led his forces to fight near Bannockburn. These areas were not just narrow, which was a disaster for the large English army. They were also marshy and completely neutralized the English cavalry power. His men used tight formations and created a circle of soldiers with long spears. As the English army tried to cross the stream, Bruce and his forces launched a surprise attack. The English army struggled to fight back, but the unfamiliar terrain worked against them. They struggled in the muddy waters, and over 4,000 of them were killed by Scot forces. Thousands of them drowned, and King Edward II himself barely escaped. Robert Bruce had won. This not only solidified his claim to the throne, it also proved that Scotland could now stand against England. Over the next 14 years, he continued to reclaim Scottish castles and territories that were still under the control of the English. By 1320, Scotland declared its sovereignty. This declaration was known as the Declaration of Arbroath. This document is to this date said to be one of the most important documents of Scottish identity. In this declaration, King Robert stated that Scotland would never surrender its freedom, even under the threat of the earth. When Pope John XXII read the document, he was moved to pressure England and the rest of Europe to acknowledge Scotland's sovereignty. By 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed. It was this treaty that showed that England had finally recognized Scotland's independence and reconsidered Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. Finally, the war was over, and Bruce could focus on solidifying Scotland's defense and her independence. However, this wouldn't last for long. The following year, Bruce died, and once again, a new line of chaos was brewing in Scotland. After Bruce died, his son King David II took over the throne. However, King David died without an heir, and this was the beginning of the rise of the Stuarts. The Stuarts were descendants of a Breton knight who had come to Scotland in the 12th century. They had served as stewards to the king, and this title soon became their family name. Over the years, they married members of the royal families and became more and more important in governance. However, It was only after the death of King David that a steward finally had access to the throne. After David died, his cousin Robert II, the grandson of Robert the Bruce, was appointed as king and became the first Stuart king in 1372. As the new king, Robert had his work cut out for him. He had to secure peace and rebuild a Scotland that was torn by wars. He worked hard and paved the way for his successors. As the Stuarts ruled over Scotland, the nation prospered with both cultural and intellectual growth. During this period, they established universities like St. Andrews in 1413. The royal court became a place for artists to create and for scholars to debate topics like religion, science, and philosophy. Under Stuart's rule, art blossomed. The Stuart kings encouraged poets, artists, and painters. Some of these kings, like James I, were also even poets and artists. But like all good things, this golden age also had to come to an end. This end began in 1542, after Mary Stuart, also known as the Queen of Scots, was born. You see, Mary's father, King James V, had died, and she became queen barely 6 days after she was born. For her safety, she was sent to France. Her mother, Marie de Guise, remained in Scotland to protect her throne. Whenever the English forces tried to take over Scotland, Marie would call on French troops for help. However, by 1550, the English had left Scotland. Marie de Guise saw this as a chance to push French culture and French interests, and this pushed the French language to the Scots. While in France, Mary became a part of the French court and got married to the Dauphin when she was 16 years old and became the Queen of France. But she couldn't remain in France forever. After her husband died in 1560, Mary had to return to Scotland. When she arrived, she discovered that all was not well. Scotland was divided between the popular Protestant reformers led by John Knox and the Catholics. It was a more dicey scenario because while the Protestants were more popular with the people, Mary herself was a Catholic. This did not win her the support of the people. The people saw the English as their allies since they were also Protestants, unlike the Catholic French. But Mary did not try to reimpose Catholicism on the people. While this allowed for peace, it made the Catholic nobles angry with her. But Mary also made other mistakes. First, she married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was a very unpopular marriage. Things went worse when her secretary David Richo was murdered. As if that wasn't bad enough, her marriage with Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, eventually ended in a scandal after he was murdered. Henry's death was suspicious, and people suspected that Mary's third husband, the Earl of Bothwell, had been responsible for his death. Mary and Bothwell, still seeking control of the throne, both went to meet the lords at Carberry Hill. However, the lords turned on them, and Bothwell left her and fled. Mary was captured by their enemies and imprisoned in Lochleven Castle. By July 1567, while in prison, Mary was forced to give up the throne so her infant son James VI could be crowned king. Mary eventually managed to escape and tried to take the throne back by force. This failed to work as she was defeated at the Battle of Langside. Abandoning her son, Mary then ran to England, hoping that her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, would protect her. However, she was only disappointed. Instead of being protected, Elizabeth locked her in prison for 19 years. It was rumored that she had plotted against the Queen, and she was eventually tried for treason in 1587 and executed on the orders of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. After Mary Stuart's tragic death, her son James VI became king when he was only a boy. Nevertheless, he had ambitions that were bigger than Scotland. But how would he achieve these when Scotland was almost in ruins? James VI became the King of Scotland when he was only 13 months old. As he grew up, everywhere he turned was chaos, but this only made him more shrewd and ambitious. Light seemed to shine on him when Queen Elizabeth I of England died in 1603. She died childless, and so her closest relative was the son of her cousin, James. Overnight, James had become the king of both Scotland and England. This was called the Union of the Crowns. But even though James was king of both kingdoms, the two domains still operated separately. Each one had its laws, parliament, and churches. But James didn't want it this way. His dream was to fully unite these two kingdoms, no matter how long it would take him. So he tried promoting peace between the two nations and even reduce cross-border tensions. King James held a religious conference in Hampton Court, and also went as far as commissioning the famous King James Bible in 1611 as a way to unite both sides. Despite all his attempts, he continued to battle both political and religious conflicts because while the English were Episcopal, those in Scotland were Presbyterians. As if that wasn't bad enough, he believed in the divine rights of the king, and for this reason, he was always having conflicts with the Parliament. You see, the Scots were mostly Presbyterians and believed in a church that was governed by elders and no bishops. The church in England, however, maintained bishops and the hierarchical church structure. This system was known as Episcopalianism. King James loved this system more, and he tried to introduce it to Scotland. The people rejected it, but the wars over religion were only starting to worsen. By 1637, James's son Charles I had taken over power and wanted to impose the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland. The people of Scotland were furious by this move and saw it as an attack on their religious independence. War was starting to brew. The following year, a group of Scots signed the National Covenant and pledged to protect their Presbyterian religion from royal interference. The signees of this covenant were known as the Covenanters. This group of rebels started a war that spread across Scotland, England, and Ireland. It was a war so great and engulfing that it became known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. By 1639, Scotland had fully started its rebellion against King Charles's attempts to force a religion on them. This was the start of the Bishop Wars. King Charles was furious and sent troops to stop their rebellion. He had thought they would easily defeat the Covenanters, but the Covenanter army was strong and defeated the English forces. After this defeat, both sides signed the Treaty of Berwick in 1639, only for war to break out the next year. The Covenanters attacked North England and forced King Charles to agree to their demands. King Charles had been humiliated twice before the rest of Europe, but it was only the beginning. Now, King Charles had always been at loggerheads with the Parliament because of his belief in the divine rights of the king. For this reason, he had gone several months without them, making them look powerless and almost foolish. The Covenanters saw this as a loophole and approached the Parliament with a deal they could not resist. In 1643, they agreed to support the Parliament against King Charles, and in return, the Parliament would push for the spread of Presbyterianism in England. This was the beginning of the English Civil Wars, and the Scots helped the Parliament win early victories. However, there was a small issue. Not every Scot supported the Covenanters. Some of them, including nobles and royals, were loyal to King Charles. This only led to many conflicts across the nation. As England fell, the Catholics in Ireland saw this as a chance to also rebel against England's rule. Everything went downhill, and by 1649, King Charles I was executed by the Parliament. The Scots were shocked, but they moved quickly and announced Charles's son, Charles II, as their king. However, there was a problem. Oliver Cromwell was leading England at the time as the head of the Commonwealth and wanted the crown. In 1650, he invaded Scotland. Even though his army was smaller than that of the Scottish, they were better trained, and he defeated the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. Several Scots were killed and captured, and Cromwell took back control of Scotland under England. But Charles II would not just give up. Desperate to keep his throne, he also invaded England, but Cromwell defeated him in Worcester, and Charles had no choice but to flee. For the Scots, they were very bitter that they had lost their independence, but they didn't have any more strength to battle. Their towns and farms had been destroyed, and several of the Scots were prisoners or had been sold as slaves. By the end of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, Scotland was weaker than ever and was now reliant on England. Would they ever be free again, or was this the start of James's dream to unify both kingdoms? After some years, Cromwell died and his regime fell. Charles II saw this as a chance, and he was restored as king once again in 1660. With his restoration, Scotland became an independent kingdom. But things were quickly taking a downturn. Towards the end of the 1660s, Scotland began to struggle economically. They suffered famine and the nation became vulnerable. But everything worsened when they tried to fix the situation with the Darien Scheme in 1690. In a desperate need to turn its economic situation around, Scotland tried to turn modern-day Panama into a trading colony. The goal was that they could rival Britain and the Dutch empires. It wasn't just an ambitious plan, it was a ridiculous plan that was bound to fail. Aside from their poor planning, the Caribbeans also resisted, and Scotland went bankrupt trying to keep it up. Now bankrupt and starving, Scotland needed help. The elites had no choice but to turn to their arch-enemy, England. However, at the time, England was also dealing with their crisis, and they were very wary of Scotland. Their Queen Anne and all of her children had died. This left a gap in the throne. England was afraid of war with Scotland, and to stabilize the shaking kingdom, they made an offer to Scotland. They offered a union of both kingdoms. Many of the Scots didn't like the idea, but English leaders bribed the Scottish nobles to support it, promising them that the union would bring an end to all the economic problems Scotland had been facing. By 1706, both kingdoms had already begun to negotiate the terms for a union. The treaty had 25 articles that planned to establish a single parliament for Great Britain, which now included Scotland. The union would also allow for free trade between England and Scotland, so that Scotland could recover. Also, the English had no right to make any changes to the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. The treaty was signed into law by both parliaments in 1707, and the Scottish Parliament was dissolved. The majority of Scottish opposed these changes and felt like their leaders had betrayed them. The Scots were given limited seats in Parliament, with only 45 members in the House of Commons and 16 in the House of Lords. Secondly, even though the Union increased trade for Scotland, they also had to share England's national debt. To compensate, England offered to pay an equivalent payment of £398,085 to Scotland. While most of the elites felt like the Union was perfect, most of the common Scots felt like they had lost their identity and autonomy. They rioted in Edinburgh and Glasgow, with several of them chanting that they had been bought and sold for English gold. Despite the seemingly perfect union, many of the common Scots wanted a return to their Scottish independence, and tensions were starting to brew. As the people protested the union, Jacobitism started to become popular. It was pushed by James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of James VII, who was also known as the Old Pretender. The Jacobites were people who wanted an independent Scotland. They believed that Scotland thrived under the Stuarts and that they were the rightful rulers of the throne. They wanted Stuart to reclaim the throne of both Scotland and England. They first attacked in 1689, and this battle was known as the Battle of Killiecrankie. Killiecrankie was located in the Highlands of Perthshire and was the perfect location for the Jacobite forces. At the time, the Jacobites were led by John Graham of Claverhouse, who was also known as Viscount Dundee. They marched down the Highland slopes and charged at the government troops, catching them off guard. Even though the Jacobites won, Viscount Dundee was killed in the battle. Without him, they struggled to continue with the rebellion, and the government had the upper hand. In 1708, the Old Pretender, James Francis, had an idea. However, this plan was stopped by the Royal Navy. Francis refused to give up and made another attempt in 1715, but that also failed. But by 1745, things had reached their peak. The Jacobites were now led by Charles Edward Stuart, who was also known as the Young Pretender, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. In 1745, he led a series of attacks known as the 45 Rising. Bonnie Prince Charlie was not only young and charismatic, he was also incredibly good-looking. He managed to get the Highland clans on his side, promising them an independent Scotland and a return to Stuart rule. He began an army, and they marched towards England. In September 1745, the Battle of Prestonpans took place. Prince Charlie and his Scot army defeated the government army in only 20 minutes. This boosted the morale of the Jacobites, and they boldly marched toward England. However, things would soon take a drastic turn. In April 1746, a battle broke out on Culloden Moor. The Jacobite army had been fighting for several months, and they were tired and outnumbered. Aside from that, They lacked supplies, so they were also hungry and poorly equipped. They stood no chance against the forces led by the Duke of Cumberland. These men were ruthless, and within an hour they had completely crushed the Jacobite army. Thousands of Scots were killed, and Bonnie Prince Charles barely escaped. After the battle, the British government punished those in the Highlands by banning their dresses and their clan meetings, and even went as far as banning the speaking of the Gaelic language. However, despite this pathetic defeat, the Scots celebrated Bonnie Prince Charlie. They saw him as a symbol of bravery and courage. He had been their last hope for Scotland's independence. They romanticized him because of not just the tragic end of the battle, but also because of his brave escape from Culloden. You see, Bonnie Prince had disguised himself as a maid so he could escape to the Isle of Skye. Scots wrote songs and books about him, immortalizing his story. After his crushing defeat, the Jacobites were not able to recover. Several of the Scots wondered if Scotland would be able to rise again, or if the dream of a golden Scotland had come to an end. As the dust settled, Scotland began to emerge from the ashes into a period of innovation. This period was known as the Scottish Enlightenment and lasted from the 18th to the 19th centuries. During this period, Scotland was able to discover new ideas that changed the world. They birthed scholars, scientists, and writers who produced groundbreaking theories. Even though the Scottish Enlightenment came to light in the 18th century, it had begun long in the universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. These schools had become global centers for learning. Two iconic figures of this period were David Hume and Adam Smith. David Hume was a philosopher who was known for laying the bricks for modern philosophy. In his work, A Treatise of Human Nature, he challenged beliefs on human understanding and reality. He questioned religion and suggested that morality existed because of human compassion and wasn't a divine command. David Hume's ideas spread across the globe because he was both revolutionary and controversial. He shaped how the modern world approached philosophy. Adam Smith, on the other hand, transformed economics. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow. In his work, The Wealth of Nations, he introduced new concepts like division of labor, free trade, and the invisible hand of the market. Adam Smith was so influential that he was tagged as the father of modern economics, and his work became the Bible of modern economics. But it wasn't just these two making groundbreaking changes. Scotland was also raising surgeons in Edinburgh who were making advancements in public health. There were others like Joseph Black, who discovered carbon dioxide, and James Hutton, who was known to be the father of geology. Scotland also made great advancements in architecture and constructed bigger cities like Edinburgh's New Town. In literature, writers like Robert Burns were able to capture Scotland in their poetry and novels to preserve its heritage. Scotland universities became popular across the globe, attracting scholars from all around Europe. Despite this new thirst for learning, a new era was already starting, and once again, Scotland would have to battle to survive. By the late 18th century, Scotland had transformed into the Industrial Revolution. This would change how Scotland would look forever. This revolution was caused by the resources in Scotland, specifically its coal and iron ore. During this time, coal mining became a popular industry that provided energy to power bigger factories and trains. Scotland was able to become a leader in engineering across the world. But Scotland wasn't just thriving on coal alone. In the Clyde River in Glasgow, something impressive was going on. They were building ships. They built some of the most beautiful and innovative ships of the 19th and 20th centuries. These ships carried goods and people across the globe. Britain had no choice but to realize the crucial role of Scotland in the expansion of Great Britain. Other towns like Paisley also became famous for making quality textiles and fine linen and wool. To date, everyone recognizes the famous Paisley pattern, which was born during this time. Factories also sprang up that created jobs for the Scots. With these factories, cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh became even more urban. Glasgow was transformed from a simple market town to an urban city. the population doubled with people coming to work in its factories and shipyards. People began to refer to it as the second city of the empire. Edinburgh, on the other hand, became a hub for learning and business. It became known as the Athens of the North and attracted both thinkers and entrepreneurs. But while it looked like everything was perfect at this time, it wasn't. The industrial factories might have created jobs, but they also created harsh working conditions. In cities like Glasgow, the population led to overcrowded houses, poor living conditions, and poverty among the working class. However, those who faced the worst consequences of the Industrial Revolution were in the countryside. They faced what was known as the Highland clearances. You see, during the late 18th and 19th centuries, landlords in the Highlands evicted thousands of tenants from their homes so they could go into sheep farming. They saw sheep farming as more profitable because it allowed them to produce wool, which was essential for the boom in textiles. They ruthlessly sent their tenants out, leaving them homeless and with no source of income, as most of them were into farming. With nowhere to go, several of them moved to the overcrowded cities, where they battled hunger and poverty. Others had no choice but to move to other countries like Canada and America, searching for a better life. These clearances left scars on Scotland and led to a decline of Highland culture and tradition. This was a turning point for Scotland. The years they were known for their clans and their battles were over. Scotland was transforming fast, but would its people be able to keep up and maintain their identity in this new world? By the early 20th century, Scotland was still battling with migration and managing its industry. However, the world was in the thick of two world wars, and Scotland found itself with it. By 1914, the First World War had broken out. Great Britain was a major part of this war, and as part of the UK, Scotland found itself joined to the war, fighting against Germany and her allies. Nevertheless, the Scotland soldiers were crucial to the British Army. They contributed more soldiers per capita than any other part of Britain. Their regiments, like Black Watch and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, were known for their courage and bravery. Back at home, Scottish cities also became crucial to the war. The shipyards in Glasgow began making warships at an incredible rate and became a key supplier to the British Navy. It soon became known as the workshop of the world. Despite this, World War I brought hardship and food shortages among the Scottish workers. By the time World War II came around, Scotland's role was even greater. Once again, Glasgow was crucial to the war efforts by churning ships while other Scottish factories churned out steel and weapons. They were so crucial that organizations such as the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board were established during this time. In 1941, German bombers had to bomb Clydebank as a means to shut down Britain's source of fleets. This was a disastrous attack that killed over 100 Scottish workers. However, the Scottish soldiers were just as brave and fought across Europe and the Pacific. Over 30,000 of them were killed, leaving Scotland with scars from the war. Women had to enter the workforce in large numbers, and people moved to the cities looking for work in the industries. As the wars ended, Scotland was also caught in the winds of decolonization. Great Britain's empire had fallen, and so Scotland had to join in to help their former colonies move to independence. Several Scottish experts in engineering, science, and education were sent across the world, but as the war ended, Scotland received a major hit. As the world stopped relying on ships, coal, and steel for the war, Scotland's major industry collapsed. This led to unemployment and several people leaving the city hopelessly. But history has shown time and time again that Scotland was not one to give up, and once again, it tried to reinvent itself with science and education. And by the late 20th century, Scotland wasn't just regrouping. It was also finding its political voice. You see, several of the Scottish people had begun to feel upset with the British government. Not only were they complaining about the taxes, but they also believed that the decisions in London did not reflect their needs. For this reason, they began to call for devolution. They wanted some of the powers to be transferred from the central British government to a new Scottish parliament that would be set up in Edinburgh. They started to support the Scottish National Party, and by 1977, they held a referendum. Most of those present voted for a Scottish Parliament, and it was created in 1999. The Scots celebrated as that was the first time the Scottish Parliament would be sitting in over 200 years. They also had powers over health and education, and had more control over their affairs. Finally, they could bask in their national pride. Today, Scotland is a country that honors its past while striving to define its future. Cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow are still thriving hubs, while the Highlands still show the beauty of the nation. But despite all the years that have passed, several Scottish people still wonder if they will get independence once again. In 2014, they held another referendum that asked the question, should Scotland be an independent country? While 45% voted to be independent, 55% voted against it. This narrow victory proved that the dream of Scotland's independence was still far from dead. Do you think Scotland will one day become an independent country? Let me know in the comment. And if you like this video, we made an entire video on the history of the colonization of America by European powers. Click on the screen now to watch the video.